The interstellar trading vessel Horizon's Call had been drifting through the sector for 3 standard weeks when the distress beacon reached them. Captain Vega stood on the bridge and listened to the broken transmission. A freighter had suffered a catastrophic engine failure near the asteroid belt. They were losing life support. They needed help. Cole was eating her breakfast in the crew mess hall when the announcement came through. She was the human liaison officer aboard the station, a position that sounded important but mostly involved translating cultural misunderstandings between humans and the dozen alien species that passed through every cycle. She set down her coffee and made her way to the docking bay. The rescue operation took 6 hours. The freighter was badly damaged, its hull cracked in 3 places, its crew of 12 barely alive when the Horizon's Call pulled them aboard. Helped with the medical triage, holding oxygen masks over scaled faces and speaking calm words to frightened aliens who did not understand her language but seemed to find comfort in her voice. It was only after the crew had been stabilized that someone mentioned the cargo. The freighter had been transporting live animals. Most of the creatures in the cargo hold had perished during the accident, their containment pods cracked and lifeless. But 3 of them had survived. 3 juvenile, barely 6 months old, huddled together in a damaged transport cage. Had never seen a before, but she had read about them in the xenobiology files. They were apex predators from the jungle world of Prime. Adults could grow to the size of small vehicles, with 6 clawed limbs, armored scales, and rows of serrated teeth designed to tear through the thick-skinned prey of their. They were considered one of the most dangerous species in the known galaxy. The juveniles did not look dangerous, they looked scared. Each cub was about the size of a large wolf from Earth. Their scales were a deep green, almost black in the dim light of the cargo bay. Their amber eyes glowed faintly, and their ears lay flat against their skulls. Low growls rumbled from their throats as the rescue team approached, but the growls were mixed with something else. High-pitched whimpers, the sound of frightened children. Station commander arrived within the hour. He was towering with deep blue scales and a permanent expression of mild irritation. He examined the damaged transport cage and spoke with the surviving crew members. The cubs had been on their way to a wildlife preserve on the far side of the sector. Their handler, a specialist named, had been killed when the engine exploded. The cubs had been alone in the dark for nearly 2 days before the rescue team found them. Ordered the cubs transferred to a temporary holding bay on the station. It was a small room with reinforced walls and a containment field generator. Not ideal for housing predator juveniles, but it would have to do until a replacement handler could be found. Watch the transfer from a distance. The security officers used stun prods to herd the cubs into the holding bay. The animals snarled and snapped at the prods, their claws scraping against the metal floor. One of the cubs lunged at an officer and nearly caught his arm before the containment field activated and pushed the animal back. The door sealed behind them. The cubs huddled in the far corner of the bay, their growls echoing off the walls. Could see them through the observation window, 3 frightened creatures pressed together for warmth and comfort. She approached Commander and asked about the timeline. When would the replacement handler arrive? Consulted his data pad and frowned. The nearest qualified specialist was stationed on a research vessel 3 sectors away. At best, they would arrive in 10 standard days. At worst, 2 weeks. Looked back at the cubs. 2 weeks was a long time for frightened animals to remain in a small room with no caretaker. She asked if anyone on the station had experience with, shook his head. They considered the species too dangerous for casual interaction. Only trained specialists were permitted to handle them. That night, returned to her quarters and accessed the station's database. She spent hours reading everything she could find about biology and behavior. She learned that the species was highly intelligent, capable of recognizing individual faces and responding to vocal commands. She learned that juveniles formed intense bonds with their caretakers during the first year of life. These bonds were essential for the cub's emotional development. Without them, the animals experienced severe psychological distress. She also learned that distress became aggressive. It was a survival mechanism, a response to perceived threats. When a cub felt abandoned or threatened, its instincts took over. It attacked anything that came close. Closed the database and sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about the cubs in the holding bay, alone and afraid. She thought about the way they had whimpered when the rescue team found them. She thought about the handler who had died, the person they had trusted, the person who would never come back. She had grown up on a ranch in Montana. Her mother had raised horses, cattle, and half a dozen dogs at any given time. Had learned to read animal behavior before she learned to read books. She knew what fear looked like in an animal's eyes. She knew what abandonment did to a creature that depended on others for safety and comfort. The cubs were predators. They had claws and teeth and the instincts of apex hunters. But they were also children. Lost, frightened children who did not understand why their world had fallen apart. Made a decision. She would not let them suffer alone. The next morning, she submitted a formal request to Commander. She asked for permission to enter the holding bay and attempt to establish contact with the cubs. The request immediately. It was too dangerous, he said. The cubs had already injured 3 security officers who had tried to feed them. No untrained personnel would be permitted near the animals. Did not argue. She simply nodded and returned to her duties. But she did not forget about the cubs. She could hear them at night, howling through the station's corridors. It was a mournful, lonely sound that echoed off the metal walls and slipped through the ventilation systems. The sound of 3 small creatures crying out for someone who would never answer. She lay awake in her bunk and listened to them howl. And she promised herself that she would find a way to help them, no matter what Commander said. 2 standard days passed and the situation grew worse with every hour. The cubs had stopped eating entirely. The food that security officers slid through the containment field remained untouched, rotting in the corner of the holding bay. The cubs would not go near it. They would not go near anything. Observed them through the observation window whenever she had a free moment. She noticed patterns in their behavior. The largest cub, a male with a darker stripe running down his spine, always positioned himself between his siblings and the door. He was the protector. He growled the loudest and lunged the hardest whenever anyone approached. The middle cub, a female with lighter green scales, paced constantly along the back wall. She was anxious, restless, unable to settle. The smallest cub rarely moved at all. He stayed curled in the corner, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. He was giving up. Brought her concerns to the station's medical officer, a named Dr. Senna. She explained what she had observed and asked if there was anything that could be done. Dr. Senna examined the cubs through the observation window and shook her head. The animals were experiencing acute stress, she said. Their cortisol levels were dangerously elevated. If the situation did not change soon, the smallest cub would likely die within the week. Asked about sedation. Could they calm the cubs down long enough to provide medical care? Dr. Senna frowned. Sedating was extremely difficult. Their metabolism burned through standard sedatives within minutes. The doses required to keep them unconscious for any length of time could damage their hearts. There had to be another way, insisted. There had to be something they could do. Dr. Senna looked at her with tired eyes. They were a practical species. They valued efficiency and order above all else. When a problem could not be solved, they moved on. The cubs were a problem that could not be solved. The doctor suggested that prepare herself for the likely outcome. Left the medical bay feeling sick to her stomach. She could not accept what she had heard. She refused to believe that 3 young lives would simply be allowed to fade away because no one knew how to help them. She returned to her research with renewed determination. She spent every off-duty hour studying behavior, searching for anything that might give her an advantage. She learned about their social structures, their communication methods, their hunting patterns. She learned that cubs in the wild stayed with their mothers for the first 3 years of life, learning essential survival skills and forming bonds that lasted a lifetime. A cub separated from its mother too early often failed to thrive. It became withdrawn, aggressive, and eventually self-destructive. The cubs in the holding bay had been separated from everything they knew. Their handler was dead. Their transport was destroyed. They were surrounded by strange smells, strange sounds, and strange creatures who prodded them with metal sticks and shouted in languages they did not understand. Of course they were aggressive. Of course they were afraid. They had lost everything. Thought about her childhood on the ranch. She remembered a spring when a late blizzard had killed 3 of their mares, leaving behind a pair of orphaned foals. The foals had been terrified, kicking and biting anyone who came near. Her mother had spent days sitting in the barn with them, not trying to touch them, not trying to feed them, just being present. She had spoken to them in a soft, steady voice until they learned that she was not a threat. Eventually, the foals had come to her on their own. They had pressed their noses against her hands and allowed her to stroke their necks. They had learned to trust again because someone had been patient enough to earn that trust. Wondered if the same approach might work with the cubs. They did not understand it. They saw the cubs as simple beasts driven by instinct, incapable of forming emotional connections with anyone other than their own kind, but suspected they were wrong. The cubs were not attacking out of malice. They were attacking out of fear, and fear could be overcome with patience and kindness. She submitted another request to Commander, this time with a detailed proposal. She asked for permission to enter the holding bay unarmed, without stun prods or restraints of any kind. She would simply sit with the cubs and allow them to become accustomed to her presence. She would not try to touch them or feed them. She would just be there. Rejected the proposal immediately. He called it reckless and irresponsible. The cubs had already proven themselves dangerous. Allowing an untrained human to enter their enclosure was an unnecessary risk that the station could not afford. Argued, she pointed to Dr. Senna's assessment, to the declining health of the smallest cub, to the mounting evidence that the cubs needed more than food and shelter. They needed connection. They needed someone to trust. Was unmoved, his decision was final. That night the howling was louder than ever. Lay in her bunk and listened to the cubs crying out in the darkness. She could hear the desperation in their voices, the raw fear that no one was coming to help them. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound still reached her. She thought about the smallest cub, the one who had stopped moving. She thought about his shallow breathing and his half-closed eyes. She thought about how alone he must feel, surrounded by walls and strangers and the constant hum of machinery. She could not let him die. She could not let any of them die. The next morning, she woke before her alarm. She dressed in her uniform and made her way to the holding bay. The security officer on duty was a young named, fresh out of training and clearly nervous about his assignment. He straightened when he saw approach. She told him that she was conducting a routine inspection on behalf of the liaison office. Hesitated. He had not been informed of any inspection. Explained that it was a standard procedure, nothing out of the ordinary. She just needed to observe the cubs for a few minutes and file a report. Glanced at his data pad, searching for guidance. He found nothing. After a long moment, he stepped aside and allowed to approach the observation window. She stood there for nearly an hour, watching the cubs. The largest one noticed her and growled, but he did not lunge. The middle one continued her restless packing. The smallest one did not move at all. Pressed her palm against the window and spoke softly. She told them that she was there. She told them that they were not alone. She told them that everything would be okay. The cubs did not understand her words, but the largest one stopped growling and tilted his head, his ears twitching forward. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at her with something other than fear. It was a beginning. On the third day, arrived at the holding bay to find a crowd gathered outside the observation window. Security officers in full tactical gear stood in a tight formation near the door. Their stun rifles were raised and ready. Commander stood at the center, his expression grim. Beside him was Security Chief, a massive with scars across his snout and cold, calculating eyes. Pushed through the crowd and demanded to know what was happening. Barely glanced at her. He explained that the situation had become untenable. The Cubs had damaged 3 containment field generators during the night. One more breach and they would escape into the station's corridor network. The risk to station personnel was too great. Stepped forward and announced the decision. The Cubs would be sedated permanently. It was the only safe option remaining. Felt the blood drain from her face. Permanently sedated. They meant to kill them. They meant to put down 3 frightened children because no one had the patience to help them. She tried to argue. She pointed out that a replacement handler was still on the way. She reminded them of Dr. Senna's assessment, of the Cubs' declining health, of the stress that was driving their aggressive behavior. If they could just wait a few more days, the specialist would arrive and take over. The Cubs did not need to die. Shook his head. The station's safety could not be compromised for the sake of 3 animals. His decision was made. Signaled to his team. The security officers moved toward the holding bay door. One of them began deactivating the containment field while the others raised their weapons. Inside the bay, the Cubs sensed the danger. They retreated to the far corner, pressing against each other. The largest Cub positioned himself in front of his siblings, his scales bristling, his growl deep and threatening. Watched through the observation window. She saw the fear in the Cub's eyes. She saw the way the smallest one trembled, too weak to even stand. She saw the middle one pressing close to her brother, seeking protection that he could not provide. And she saw raise his rifle, taking aim at the largest Cub's chest. Something inside snapped. She did not think, she did not plan, she simply moved. She pushed past the security officers and threw herself through the holding bay door before anyone could stop her. The containment field crackled as she passed through it, sending a jolt of pain through her body, but she did not slow down. She placed herself directly between the rifles and the Cubs. Shouted at her to move. His voice was sharp with anger and surprise. Behind him, the other officers shifted nervously, their weapons still raised but uncertain. They had been trained to neutralize threats, not to fire through a fellow crew member. Did not move. She stood her ground and faced the security team, her arms spread wide. Commander pushed forward, his expression furious. He demanded that she step aside immediately. This was a direct violation of his orders. She would face disciplinary action. She would be removed from her position. Met his eyes and spoke calmly. She told him that she understood the consequences. She told him that she accepted whatever punishment he chose to give her. But she would not move. She would not stand by and watch 3 innocent creatures be killed because no one was willing to try another way. Behind her, the Cubs growled louder. She could feel their hot breath on her back, could sense their tension, their readiness to attack. They did not trust her any more than they trusted the security officers. To them, she was just another threat. Slowly, carefully, turned her back on the rifles. She faced the Cubs instead. It was the most terrifying moment of her life. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away from the predators that could tear her apart in seconds. But she forced herself to stay still. She lowered herself to one knee, making her body smaller. She kept her movements slow and deliberate. She remembered what her mother had taught her about frightened animals. Never make sudden movements. Never raise your voice. Let them see that you are not a threat. The largest Cub snarled, baring rows of serrated teeth. He was inches from her face, close enough that she could count the scales on his snout. His amber eyes burned with fear and rage. His claws scraped against the floor as he prepared to lunge. Spoke one word, calm and firm. Enough. The Cub hesitated, his snarl faltered. He tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching forward. He had never heard a sound quite like that before, not threatening, not afraid, just steady, just present. Extended her hand, palm down, fingers relaxed. She did not reach toward the cub. She simply offered her hand and waited. The cub sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring. He smelled her fear, her sweat, her racing heartbeat. But he also smelled something else. Patience, calm, a willingness to wait. The seconds stretched into minutes. No one in the holding bay moved. The security officers stood frozen, their rifles still raised. Commander watched with wide eyes, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Dr. Senna had arrived at some point and stood near the observation window, her data pad forgotten in her hand. The largest cub took a step closer, then another. He lowered his snout until it nearly touched his palm. She could feel the heat radiating from his scales, could hear the deep rumble in his chest. She did not pull away. The cub pressed his nose against her hand. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. He had made a choice. He had decided against every instinct that this strange creature might not be an enemy. Behind him, the middle cub crept forward. She was more cautious than her brother, circling around instead of approaching directly. She sniffed its boots, her uniform, her hair. She found nothing threatening. Slowly, hesitantly, she settled beside its left leg. The smallest cub moved last. He was so weak that he could barely stand. He dragged himself across the floor, whimpering softly until he reached his feet. He curled around her right boot and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, his trembling stopped. Looked down at the three cubs gathered around her. The largest rested his heavy head on her knee. The middle one pressed against her side. The smallest lay at her feet, finally at peace. She looked up at Commander and the security team still frozen in the doorway. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply spoke. They just needed someone to stay. The silence in the holding bay stretched for what felt like hours. Still held his rifle, but his aim had dropped. His cold eyes had softened into something approaching confusion. The other security officers exchanged uncertain glances, their training offering no guidance for what they were witnessing. Commander was the first to move. He stepped slowly through the doorway, his posture no longer rigid with authority. He stopped several feet from and the cubs, watching with an expression she could not quite read. Wonder, perhaps, or disbelief. Maybe both. Dr. Senna pushed past the security officers and approached with her scanner raised. She moved carefully, keeping her distance from the cubs while reading their vital signs. After a long moment, she looked up at and reported her findings. The cubs' stress hormones had dropped significantly. Their heart rates were stabilizing. The smallest one, the one she had expected to die, was showing signs of recovery. Asked how this was possible, Dr. Senna shook her head. She had no explanation. By every measure of science, the cubs should have attacked the human the moment she entered their enclosure. Instead, they had accepted her. They had trusted her. Remained still, the cubs pressed close around her. The largest one had begun to purr, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through her leg where his head rested. The middle one had closed her eyes, her breathing slow and steady. The smallest one had not moved from her boot, but his color was already improving. She spoke quietly, not wanting to disturb them. She explained what she had learned from her research. Cubs needed connection. They needed to feel safe. When their handler died and they were surrounded by strange beings in a strange place, their instincts had told them that everyone was an enemy. The aggression was a defense mechanism, a wall they had built to protect themselves from more pain. All she had done was show them that she was not going to hurt them. She had stayed when everyone else had backed away. She had remained calm when they snarled and snapped. She had given them the one thing no one else had offered: patience. Listened in silence. When she finished, he nodded slowly. He admitted that he had underestimated the situation. He had viewed the cubs as simple animals, governed entirely by instinct, incapable of emotional complexity. He had been wrong. He ordered to stand down. The security team lowered their weapons and filed out of the holding bay. The danger had passed. The cubs were no longer a threat. Spent the next several hours in the holding bay with the cubs. She did not try to leave. She understood that if she walked away now, she might undo everything she had achieved. The cubs had just begun to trust her. That trust was fragile, easily broken. She needed to show them that she was reliable. Dr. Senna brought food and water, setting them just inside the doorway before backing away. The cubs watched her with wary eyes but did not growl, waited until the doctor had gone, then slowly reached for the food container. She placed a small piece of meat in her palm and offered it to the largest cub. He sniffed it carefully, then took it from her hand with surprising gentleness. His teeth could have easily removed her fingers, but he was careful. He chewed slowly, watching her the entire time. When he finished, she offered another piece. He took that one too. The middle cub came next, then the smallest. They ate from her hand one piece at a time, learning that she was a source of comfort rather than danger. By the time the food container was empty, all three cubs had eaten more than they had consumed in the previous 3 days combined. That night stayed in the holding bay. The station provided her with a blanket and a pillow, and she made a small bed in the corner near the cubs. They watched her with curious eyes as she settled down to sleep. The largest cub approached first, sniffing her blanket before curling up beside her. The middle one followed, pressing against her back. The smallest one crawled into her lap and tucked his head under her chin. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of their breathing. It was strange, she thought, how quickly things could change. 3 days ago, these cubs had been marked for death. Now they were sleeping peacefully against her body, trusting her to keep them safe through the night. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the station. By morning, crew members from every department had found excuses to walk past the holding bay observation window. They stared in amazement at the human woman sitting calmly among 3 predator cubs, scratching behind their ears while they rumbled with contentment. They did not understand it. Their culture valued strength and dominance. When faced with a dangerous animal, they subdued it or destroyed it. The idea of earning an animal's trust through patience and kindness was foreign to them. Yet here was proof that such an approach could work. Dr. Senna visited regularly to monitor the cub's health. She reported steady improvement across all metrics. The smallest cub, whom had started calling Pip, was gaining weight and showing increased activity. The middle one, whom she named Luna, had stopped her anxious packing and now spent most of her time playing with scraps of cloth that had fashioned into toys. The largest, whom she called Scout, had appointed himself as her personal guardian. He followed her everywhere within the holding bay and growled softly whenever anyone other than Dr. Senna approached the door. Commander visited on the 2nd day. He stood at the edge of the holding bay and watched play with the cubs. Scout eyed him warily but did not growl. Luna ignored him entirely. Pip was too busy chewing on sleeve to notice. Admitted that he had filed a report with the sector authority regarding the incident. He had initially intended to request disciplinary action against for her insubordination, but after reviewing the outcome, he had changed his mind. Instead, he had recommended her for a commendation. Thanked him but said that she did not need recognition. She had not done what she did for praise or advancement. She had done it because it was right. Studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded and left without another word. Returned her attention to the cubs. Scout had stretched out beside her, his heavy head resting on her thigh. Luna was chasing her own tail in circles. Pip had fallen asleep in the crook of her arm, his small claws wrapped loosely around her wrist. She smiled and stroked Scout's scales. For the first time since arriving she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The news reached the broader galactic network within 3 standard days. Communication channels across a dozen sectors buzzed with reports of the human woman who had calmed 3 predators using nothing but patience and kindness. Requested interviews. Diplomats sent formal inquiries. News outlets from worlds had never heard of sought permission to broadcast her image. She ignored most of it. She had more important things to focus on. The replacement handler never arrived. The research vessel carrying him had been diverted to respond to an emergency on the far side of the sector. It would be at least another month before a qualified specialist could reach. But the wildlife preserve on Prime could not wait that long. The cubs needed proper facilities, open space, and the company of their own kind. Commander presented the problem too on the morning of the fifth day. The transport ship Wandering Star was scheduled to depart for Prime in 2 weeks. It could carry the cubs to the preserve, but someone would need to accompany them during the journey. Someone they trusted. Did not hesitate, she volunteered immediately. Warned her that the journey would take nearly 3 weeks. She would be confined to a small cargo hold with 3 juvenile predators for the entire duration. If anything went wrong, help would be far away. She understood the risks, she said. She was willing to accept them. The preparations took several days. Dr. Senna worked with the transport crew to modify one of the cargo holds into a suitable living space for the cubs. They reinforced the walls, installed climate controls, and created a comfortable sleeping area with padding and blankets. Supervised every detail, making sure that the cubs would have everything they needed. On the day of departure, half the station came to see them off. Crew members lined the corridors as led the cubs toward the docking bay. Scout walked at her left side, his scales gleaming in the artificial light. Luna pranced beside him, her tail swishing with excitement. Pip rode on shoulders, his small claws gripping her uniform for balance. Commander was waiting at the airlock. He extended his hand in the human gesture of farewell that had taught him weeks ago. She took it and shook firmly. He wished her safe travels and told her that she would always be welcome at. The journey aboard the Wandering Star was long but peaceful. Spent her days in the cargo hold with the cubs, playing games, practicing commands, and simply enjoying their company. Scout had grown protective of her to an almost comical degree. He positioned himself between her and the door whenever someone approached and rumbled warnings at any crew member who lingered too long. Luna had developed a playful personality. She loved to chase things and had fashioned a simple ball from scraps of packing material. Luna would bat it around the cargo hold for hours, pouncing and tumbling, and generally causing cheerful chaos. Pip had recovered fully from his earlier decline. He was still the smallest of the 3, but he was no longer weak or listless. He had discovered that his boots were his favorite place in the universe. Whenever she sat down, he would immediately curl around her feet and refuse to move. The crew of the Wandering Star had been nervous at first. They had heard stories about their power and their predatory instincts. But as the days passed and they observed the cubs interacting with, their fear turned to fascination. By the end of the journey, several crew members were visiting the cargo hold regularly just to watch the cubs play. Prime appeared on the 18th day. It was a jungle world, covered in dense green forests and winding rivers. The wildlife preserve occupied a protected region in the southern hemisphere, far from any settlements. It was the closest thing to the cubs' natural habitat that existed off there. The preserve keepers met them at the landing site. They were a mixed group of wildlife specialists from half a dozen different species. Their leader was a tall female named, one of the few members of her species who had chosen to work with other races rather than remain in isolation. Watched with wide eyes as led the cubs down the boarding ramp. Scout stayed close to her side, his attention fixed on the unfamiliar surroundings. Luna bounded ahead, eager to explore. Pip remained firmly attached to his boots. The keepers had expected frightened, aggressive juveniles. They had prepared sedatives and restraints just in case. Instead, they found 3 calm, well-adjusted cubs who responded to verbal commands and showed no signs of distress. Approached and asked how she had done it. No human had ever successfully bonded with juveniles before. It was considered impossible. Shrugged, she explained that she had simply treated them like any other frightened child. She had given them patience, consistency, and the assurance that she would not abandon them. The rest had happened naturally. Nodded slowly. She said that the preserve would be honored to care for the cubs, but she also extended an invitation, would consider staying for a while to help them transition. Her presence would make the adjustment much easier. Agreed without hesitation. The next 2 weeks were some of the happiest of her life. She watched the cubs explore their new home, running through open meadows and climbing trees and swimming in the cool streams that crisscrossed the preserve. Scout grew bolder every day, venturing farther from her side as he realized that this place was safe. Luna made friends with the other juveniles at the preserve, racing them through the underbrush and wrestling in the tall grass. Pip discovered insects and spent hours stalking them with intense concentration. On her last day at the preserve, sat in the central meadow and watched the cubs play. Scout noticed that something was different. He broke away from his siblings and approached her, his amber eyes searching her face. She stroked his scales and told him that she had to go. She had duties waiting for her, but she promised that she would visit. She promised that she would never forget him. Scout pressed his forehead against her chest, had explained that this gesture was reserved for family, held him close and let the tears fall. She boarded the transport back to human space that evening. In her pocket was a communication device that had given her. It would allow her to stay in contact with the preserve and receive updates on the cubs. 3 months later, received a transmission from the Galactic Council. They had established a new division within the Relations Bureau dedicated to wildlife rehabilitation and cross-species bonding research. They were calling it the Human Integration Program. Her name had been submitted as the founding director. She accepted the position the same day. Across the galaxy, species who had long viewed humans as fragile and unremarkable began to reconsider. Perhaps true strength was not measured in claws or fangs. Perhaps the most powerful force in the universe was simply the willingness to stay when everyone else fled. To kneel before growling predators and say, with quiet certainty, enough.